Welcome back. Now we're going to start to tie all this stuff together and build that word story game. But before we can write the code, we have to build the HTML page so that the user can enter data in. And you can see here, I'm showing you wordstory.html. It's a nice enough looking page. But of course, we're real programmers. The first thing we do when we see a web page is look at the source. So let's go take a look at the source code and see how it looks. Alright, in the header area you can see that we have an external style sheet, that's what's happening here, and also an external JavaScript file. I'll explain how that works in a little bit. But what we're really interested in right now is the HTML. And if you look at the HTML, this is some nice looking HTML if you ask me. It's pretty nicely written so you can see what's going on. Mainly it's a form. The form contains a field set, and the field set contains a series of label and input pairs. Each of the labels is carefully designated to go along with a particular input. Each input has an ID, and I've created one of these pairs for each of the inputs that I want for my game. Okay, that makes lots of sense. Notice that the way we've formatted and laid things out makes it very, very easy to see what's going on. This is a very important part of programming. In addition to all the label and input pairs, we have a button object. And the button is pretty interesting. It's a button type button. And on click, it will call a tell story function, which of course I'll have to write. And that's it. That's all there is to the HTML. So that seems pretty easy, right? Sure it does. And if you look at the web page, it looks great too. But that did not come for free. You see, it only looks as good as it does because I used some CSS to tell it how it's supposed to appear. So by default, just putting up labels and input elements doesn't really look like anything in particular. We have to apply some new CSS rules to get there. Now know that today I'm going to scream through a certain kind of CSS layout. We can spend a whole lot more time on it, but I just want to give you the basics so that you can build a form that looks good. Sound good? Okay. Now to see exactly what's happening, I'm going to use another special tool in my browser. I'm using Chrome, which is my favorite browser for code editing because it has some really cool tricks like the one I'm about to show you. You see, boy's name, we might not know by looking at the page, but that is a label. If I right-click on that label and say Inspect Element, then a nifty new thing shows up on the bottom of my page. Down here, I've got this lovely thing that shows me the code corresponding to the thing I just clicked on. Whoa, that's amazing. Not only can I look at that, I could even change it if I wanted to. I don't know, dragon's name. Okay, it's just temporary. It doesn't really change anything for real. So I could change that. Whoa, that's crazy. Let's change it back. And I can look at things and I can find out a lot more information about the various pieces of my program. In fact, when I click on something down here in this little listing area, it shows me the corresponding thing on the main page. So that's really, really powerful. But wait, that's not all. Not only, I'm going back to the label here, can I see the HTML code corresponding to the thing that I've highlighted, I can also look at the CSS. Ooh, so actually what you'll see is that I have applied in that mysterious wordstory.css file a whole bunch of CSS rules to the labels and to the input elements and to the button. And so we can see all of those in just a minute, but to understand how they all work, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to temporarily turn them off. Oh, that's crazy. In fact, let's go to the input element, and we'll turn it off there too, and we'll even turn off the CSS for the button. This is a marvelous tool for understanding what's happening in CSS because you can turn various rules on and off and see in real time what they do. And in fact, you can even add more rules if you need to, at least temporarily, and see what they do. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, it really is amazing. So let's go back to the label. You can click on any label if you're following along at home. And you can see the various CSS rules that I've added in the style sheet. Well, right now they're turned off. Let's turn them on one at a time to see what's going on. But before we get too uptight about that, look at how the page looks right now. Well, it's ugly. You won't hurt my feelings. It is ugly because there's nothing telling it, hey, I want it to look kind of table-ish. I want the labels to all be lined up. I want the input elements to be lined up. We have to tell it to do that, but it's not difficult to do so. There's a few ways to do it. Some of you may say, well, what we need here is a table. Well, yeah, that could work, but that's turned out to not be the best solution. I'm going to show you the technique that most developers use now, which is called a floating layout. All right, so the first thing we have is a rule called float left. And so when I apply float left to all of the labels, you can see what the labels do. Well, they all float to the left. Andy, that's not better. Okay, I agree. That's not better. But it's a little closer to what we want. Now, all the labels are taken out of the normal layout scheme and they're floated as far to the left as they can. The float was originally used for images, so you could float an image and have the text wrap around it. But it's also used for other elements as well. And today it's used quite commonly in conjunction with some other rules to get some nice layouts. So we float the label left. Now the problem with that is, of course, we didn't float the input elements left, so now they're not in order. All right, no problem. Let's go over to the inputs and float them to the left too. Okay, that works a little better, at least. No, it doesn't really look much better at all, but at least they're back in the right orders. Can you give me that? Sure. Okay, let's go back to the label, and let's look at some other interesting things we can do. Whenever you use a float mechanism, it's often a good idea to also use a width. So I will specify the width of my labels to be 250 pixels wide. Oh, that's cool. And you can see there they are. They're 250 pixels wide, and given the rest of the design, that's looking a lot better. Now, in this particular case, it's true that they're lined up pretty already, but that wouldn't be guaranteed. I don't know if I change the font size. Oh, that's the wrong one. It could get messed up. No, it looks like it's going to be pretty happy right there. But it's not guaranteed. That's still a starting place. Another thing that we can do is to use what's called the clear command. And the clear command tells it, hey, this thing, the label, should always be as far left as it can go. There should be nothing to the left of it. And you can see what happens if I turn off the width and the clear. Okay, it all looks bad. If I turn on the clear, you can see that every time I got to a label, it was clear to the left. There was nothing to the right of it. Make sense? Okay. Now with that and adding the width, now we're starting to get something that looks a whole lot closer to what we want. Would you agree? Sure. Now, I don't like how far away those labels are from the text boxes. I mean, they feel like they're a mile away, and I want it to be easy for the user to read them. So I wonder if there is some way to set the text alignment. And what text alignment is, well, how is text aligned within its container? So there is, of course, exactly that kind of tool, text align right. So by setting the text align to left, everything's pushed over to the left within its container. By setting text align right, well, then it's pushed over to the right. Of course, there's text align center, which centers everything within its own element. Oh, that's neat. But you know, we need some personal space. These look like they're too far to the right. We really could use a little bit of room between the element and the input. So there's one more fun trick we can use here called padding right, which gives us a little bit of space. By setting the padding right to 1 EM, an M is a technical term for the width of the largest character in the current font. That gives us a little bit of space. You don't absolutely have to have all this memorized. I'm telling you, in fact, I'll give you the CSS file. You can reuse it if you want. But this is getting us closer to something that looks like what we want. But what about the button? The button is still not where we want it to be. We want it to be underneath everything and looking good. Yeah? Okay, well, we can do that. Here, I'll come on down and we'll look at the buttons code. And you can see that it also has some CSS that I've turned off. Let's turn that back on line by line and see what it's doing. Well, one of the tools we can do is we can change the basic behavior of any sort of element. The display is typically set to inline for form elements, which means, they line up like ordinary text. And that's what we've wanted for the other things. But we don't want the button to do that. We want the button to be on a line by itself. So we're going to change its display to block, so it's going to act a little bit more like, like a headline or something, having a line to its own. We'll also use the clear. Now remember when we used clear for left, then this thing was guaranteed to be there was going to be nothing to the left of it. If you clear right, there's guaranteed to be nothing to the right of it. If we clear both, it's guaranteed to be on a line by itself. And that's what I've done. But it ought to be centered. It doesn't look good. I know, we'll use the text align center. Well, careful. Text align is already set to center. Do you see that the text is centered inside the button? Text align allows you to change the alignment of text inside an element. If you want to align the element itself, first of all, it needs to be a block element. Check, we did that. And secondly, you need to set the margins. And what you do is you can set both margin left and margin right to auto, and that will center an element. Oh, that's pretty cool, isn't it? Yes, indeed, it's very cool. And now we have a page that looks pretty good. Okay, let's do one more thing. Let's actually look again at the source code and see how the CSS file is really written. Now, if you recall, we already talked about how to build an external CSS file. You use the link element to say, hey, my CSS is somewhere else. And it's going to be in a file called wordstory.css. You take a look at that file, and it's very straightforward. For the most part, it's the stuff that I've just showed you, with a few more special things. So H1, I'm going to say, hey, center all of the heading level 1s. Field set, that's the form itself. I gave that a specific width, and I set its margin left and margin right to auto, so it would be centered inside the page. Label has all of the various things that we just said. We float it to the left, give it a width of 250 pixels, clear it to the left, set the text alignment to right, and the padding right to 1em. And okay, that all works. That makes the labels look good. We also set the input float to left. Then the button, set its display to block, clear it in both ways, set margin left and margin right, both to auto. One more thing we haven't talked about yet is the output, because you can't really see it yet. But the output is going to be where the actual story shows up. And so for now, I'll say, okay, if I have a div called output, its font size should be big. We should center it. Its width will be 400 pixels. And we'll center the box itself by setting the margin left and the margin right, both to auto. Now again, don't really memorize this. In fact, this is a pretty standard kind of CSS you'll use with pretty much any form. So for that reason, I've already given you a form.css file that you can have. You can just take it and save it to your own disk, and anytime you've got a form that you want to display, you can start with that form.css and just use the link tool to bring that in. And then, of course, if you want to modify it yourself, you're very welcome to. This is just useful for cases like this where we really want to make an HTML page look pretty good. The truth is, in most of our games, we'll be using other mechanisms to position stuff, so we won't need it until we're doing, say, text input and output. Pretty exciting, though, isn't it? All right, come back next time and we'll finally write the code to make this game actually play. I'll see you then.